get the recordings. We started recording this meeting, so you can go back and watch them. I'm planning to take DA 100 this month. DA 100, what is that? So DA 100 sounds like the exam that I took in beta, which is analyzing Power BI with Power BI. I took it a while back, and actually recently Microsoft told me that I passed. But this is a analyzing new exam for analyzing data with Power BI, I think it was called. That exam obviously was going to become more and more important. I think also it's going to become a credit for gold certification and other certifications as well. It's a good exam. I had to sit for 3 hours to get the whole thing, but yeah. Nice. Cool. Well, my name is Teo Lachev, your fearless leader for almost 10 years. Believe it or not, next month it's going to be 10-year anniversary for our group in Atlanta, and I'm so sorry that we won't be able to give it a proper celebration, but it is what it is. So welcome you to this meeting, our July 6th meeting. And as usual, let me see. Got 46 people. All right. As usual, I don't know how many of you are new to the group. Could you just put kind of a message in the chat window? I know David, David is a new, and also he will present. How about that? All the newcomers, we ask them to present immediately. All right, so we've got a few new people. I'm new. Okay. Those of you who joined us recently, I mean, we had somebody from Mexico. I think that was the furthest away. Anybody from any other country than the United States? Curious how far we reach. Well, I guess Mexico is the next frontier. All right, cool. So as usual, especially those of you who are new, will probably benefit from this intro to our group and some housekeeping things to keep in mind. There is some background noise. I'm gonna mute you guys. I apologize for that for the sake of everyone. Again, those of you who joined us recently, we started recording this meeting. If you object, if you don't want to be recorded, now is the time maybe to don't share any sensitive information or whatever, but otherwise we record the whole thing. And I'm gonna mute you. Okay. Cool. So if you are new to our group, we have not one, not two, but we have 3 websites, just because we believe in redundancy, and we believe, and people are asking us nicely from different places, so we can't refuse. So we're on Meetup, we are on Dynamic Communities, which is a Microsoft thing, kind of a Microsoft with another company, and we are also, since the very beginning of this group, we were affiliated with what? With pass.org. So actually our main page is atlantabipass.org, right? So those of you who are new, what do you do at this point? Quick as a bunny, you go to that URL and you associate yourself with the group. Why would you want to associate? Because we're going to start asking you for money, for donations. No, I'm joking. No, you're going to associate because you're going to get notifications, so you never miss the meeting. So atlantabi.pass.org is our main website. And one thing that we really appreciate if you do, now not so important in this age of virtualization, but when we meet in person in the Atlanta office, we want to know how many people are coming, because that's how we plan food and drinks. But still, even in those times, I would like to know in advance what audience we're expecting. So for example, I'm seeing that right now we're expecting about 70 people, maybe even more. We'll see. And What else? While you're on this page, RSVP, spread the word. If you like what you're getting back in return, invite your coworkers or whatever. And as I mentioned, we started doing recordings. So the recordings actually, this slide deck that I'm presenting right now, it's on the also uploaded in Atlanta BI. So very frequently people ask, well, how do I get the slide deck? How do I get this and that? All right, so once you go to this atlantabi.pass.org, you go and click resources, and this is where we've got everything that was shared, including the presentation decks, the slide deck. We put it in there. So for recordings, I have a link here. I tried to beautify it a little bit, but what we started doing since the previous meeting was to record the meetings, and I upload them on YouTube. And this is the link: https://bit.ly atlantabi-rex. All right. So you go there, no sign up required, and you can watch prior meeting, including this one. Get involved. Right now, sponsorship, the situation kind of took care of sponsors and speakers, but sure that one day when the things improve, we're going to resume again. And we need sponsors we're entirely self-reliant. We don't get any help, financial or so, from other organizations. So sponsors help us to cover cost for drinks, for food and drinks. Speakers, if you want to present, please let me know. Donations, if you want to contribute some amount when we don't have sponsors so we can cover operational costs, then they're also welcome on that URL. Next thing, usually at this point, I'd like to kind of poll the audience, which is especially relevant now with budget actually being frozen and so forth. But is anybody looking for BI talent? Does anybody have any job openings around Microsoft BI or beyond? Please unmute yourself, or if you want to tell us about it, or put the details in the chat window. Speaking about chat window, I'm promising I try to be disciplined to see what you guys doing there. All right, so anybody having any job opening, anything that you want to share as far as job opportunities? Guess not. I'm interested in entry level. Okay, those are people I'm looking for clients. Yeah, so looking for clients, all right, so I'll let you actually correspond about this in the chat window. Meanwhile, I'm gonna move on. And the next section will be events for the rest of this year. As far as BI or beyond, Microsoft Ignite is the next big thing in November 4 and 8. That's going to be a virtual conference. Supposed to be in Orlando, Florida, and I'm pretty sure actually it's going to go virtual. That URL is wrong, so sorry about this. This is about SQL Saturday, which got canceled. But Microsoft Ignite, previously known as TechEd, is the Microsoft Premium Conference. So that one is going to be November 4 and 8, between 4 and 8. Then we have a PASS Summit coming the week after. And you've got the URL. I don't know what's the registration. I think both of them should be open for everyone, but let me know if I'm wrong. Does anybody have any other announcements? Any other events that other than Microsoft Ignite and PASS Summit? Anyone? Damu, you typically always have something to advertise? Anything interesting? Guess that's it. Cool. Next one, a few news or announcements about some features that inspired interest since the last time we met. which was on June 1st. There isn't much interesting stuff going on, at least based on my opinion, since the June 1st. In Power BI, we have improved mobile layout, which I'm going to show you a little bit of that in a moment. Does anybody want to say something? I'm hearing some noise.
Yeah, the question, the past summit 2020, is there a fees for that?
So I did not look at it for I guess recently, but let's see, what do they say? Past virtual summit. Virtual, so it's gonna be virtual. You don't want to miss it. Register now. So if we're gonna register, all right. So we have, yeah, it looks like there are some fees. So it's not gonna be free.
Huh.
So take a look at that and see. I wonder if there is like a pure virtual event. I guess all of them are virtual. I don't know. Take a look at that and see what you find there.
Yeah, right now it says like $400.
400 for Monday, Tuesday. This is only for pre-con though, pre-con sessions. So I guess this is the bundle here, and then you have full day, 3-day, the 3-day virtual summit, the actual event, 599. Maybe if you drop me an email, I'll try to find with the organizers, see if there's going to be any like free passes or anything like that. But it looks like 499, which is 200 less than the standard non-tainted download price. Okay. All right, so going back to the announcements, improve mobile layout. I'm going to show you a little bit of that in a moment. Model view enable for live connections to announcers. I'm going to show you a little bit of that in a moment. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. Obviously, the June release of Power BI Desktop was released, but those are the two big ones, in my opinion, actually justify warrant your interest. So this meeting is going to be DAX visualization techniques. I'm actually very excited about this. I actually didn't know. I've been following Power BI for a long, long time, even before it was Power BI. I didn't know actually we can do this in Power BI. So I learned something new from David. And actually these techniques are very, very useful. For example, the one that I talked with him about was that, let's say you have a table or a matrix and want to embed a chart in it, like a bullet graph or something like that, actually that repeats on every row in the table. Well, natively Power BI doesn't support that. We cannot actually nest one visualization into another. But David actually figured out a technique to do that, which I hope he will present tonight. And that was something that I didn't know. And the next meeting was, we typically meet, those of you who are new to the group, typically meet on Monday, the first Monday of the month. So the next one is going to be August 3rd, which coincides with our 10th anniversary, as I said. It's going to be another very interesting presentation, actually. And it came from a real life project that I recently finished for kind of a large client. They came up with Power BI dashboard. Actually, I have a blog about this, or multiple blogs, a couple of blogs about that as well. Recently, today actually I wrote part 2. But the first one was very interesting because they came up, they had a design about Power BI dashboard, and the developers followed that design to the point. And there were some things on that dashboard that Power BI didn't support, so they keep on adding visual after visual. So eventually they end up with 100+ visuals for the first page, which is the main dashboard on the report. Everything was great, but that page took like 20-25 seconds to load, right? So then look into it, we saw there are too many visuals which actually render sequentially in Power BI. That's one thing that you cannot do anything about. But then we discover ways to kind of minimize the number of visuals. So I have a blog about it. Chris Hamill also was instrumental in this effort from Microsoft. So that's another one that I highly recommend, especially if you are involved in Power BI visualizations, reports. highly recommend actually you put this on the schedule for your schedule for August 3rd. Nice. So this section, we call it prototypes with pizza, but now we don't have pizza anymore. So it's actually prototype without pizza. But the idea here is to give you some tips and tricks. You know, somebody who doesn't want to do a full presentation of 1 hour, but it's got something very interesting to share. This is actually the place to do that. And today, what I'm going to show you is some couple, you know, a little bit of these two new features. So I'm going to jump to a Power BI report. And let's say my scenario is, oh, this report is great. I just finished it, but I want to also enable it, my managers to view it on mobile devices, on iPhones, Android phones, and things like this. So those of you who've been following Power BI for a while, they know that we have a technology called Power BI Mobile, which is a free app for Android and iPhone devices and Windows devices. Those of you who are still on Windows phones, right? But the problem with this is that if I wanted the report to be rendered in a portrait mode, which is the first thing that the user sees, you know, they're in portrait mode, they go to the app. What they have to do is to create mobile layout in Power BI desktop. The problem with this mobile layout, at least up to the this release, the June release of Power BI. Oops, my sharing. Let's see. Second attempt to go to mobile layout. The problem with this mobile layout until up to recently was that, well, two major issues. The first one is that
we can't see your screen.
you cannot.
No.
Oh, why didn't you guys tell me? I've been going on for like 30 minutes now. I gotta repeat the whole thing. So sorry about this. You guys cannot. It was interesting because actually it was showing that I'm sharing, but apparently not. How about now? You guys, can you guys see it?
There we go.
Yep.
That's good.
Sit. So I'm not going to go through everything that I did, you know, the slides, the introductory slides. I just want to, well, we'll get to it at the end, I guess. But you know, in the Power BI desktop, there is a button to let you define a mobile layout. You guys know about this probably. Those of you who are optimizing reports for Power BI Mobile. The problem with this layout, the first one was that the grid was very coarse. Actually, you cannot fit many visuals on it. And the second, probably bigger issue was that you cannot overlay visuals. You can do that in landscape mode. You can put one visual on top of the other, and you can do some very interesting effects, you know, if you use this technique. But in Power BI Mobile, you couldn't. You only had to lay out visuals sequentially or next to each other, but they cannot overlap. They couldn't overlap until recently. So now in the June release of Power BI Desktop, we've got much, you know, kind of more granular, if you wish, grid, which allows you to position visuals more kind of precisely. And the best thing is that you can also overlay them. So I'm going to do something very silly here, but maybe I can put that logo in there. So now I've got the logo overlaying the slicer. You couldn't do this before. So this is actually great news. If you're looking for a way to make your portrait, Power BI portrait mode more, I guess, sophisticated in Power BI Mobile, now actually we can do that. So that's the first thing that I wanted to show you. The next thing is not going to be very, I guess, probably won't find it very interesting for now, but Microsoft has announced that they're working on extending Power BI Desktop to allow you to create composite models. In other words, to do a hybrid models when you connect to, when you have a live connection, for example, to SQL Server analysis services, and to be able also to add other data sources, because up to this moment, once you connect to analysis service, for example, or publish data sets in Power BI, that's the only data source the report can see. So there is a work in progress to make this more flexible, and I'm going to show you something that, at least the first thing that Microsoft released. So I'm going to go and connect to SQL Server Analysis Services Tabular, but the same feature will work with published data sets. So connecting here to a tabular model that is on my local machine. Nothing interesting here. Power BI Desktop essentially acts as a presentation layer connected to the Analysis Services Tabular. But what's new is that this tab, the Model tab, previously that wasn't available. Once you connect to Analysis Services or Published Dataset, all you're going to get is the ability to create reports. The Power Query, the data view is not available. The Power Query is not available, and the model. Now at least we can actually use this model tab to see the metadata of the cube. So this cube is deployed to, it could be Azure Analysis Services, could be on-prem. At least I can see how the tables are related. I can see the structure of that model. So how is that useful? So far, not that useful. You cannot make changes to it. This is read-only, which is probably what you want to do anyway, because you want to publish that cube. That's going to become your semantic model. And you don't want report designers actually to change it. They can create calculations on top of that. They can do measures, but not anything else. For the time being, it's useful because it shows you the metadata of the model. If you want to get a little bit more understanding about how the tables relate, what tables are in the model, we have this now. And again, expect more things, more exciting things to happen in the future, hopefully this year. Question about this?
Are you still with us, Teo?
I am. Can you hear me?
I could hear you now. It cut out for a bit.
So sorry about this. I accidentally exited the meeting, but I'm back. Don't worry, guys. I'm gonna stay on, which is actually the end of my presentation. Does anybody, does anybody have any questions about what I covered so far? Let's see, Rebecca, depending on your data model, you should be able to do that through the Power BI UI. I not have to write DAX, so maybe I missed the conversation here. I need help with DAX. I need to rank country by year based on total sales. Feel free to let me know if you have some tips. Okay, you guys got the conversation. Very nice. Anybody have any questions about what I show so far, these new features? Guess not. All right then, so I'm gonna turn it to Dave. Actually, apologize. I think my recording probably has started. No, actually, it's still going on. Very nice. Dave, you're sharing the screen, right?
Yes. Hopefully
Yes.
you can see Power BI Desktop here with DAX visualization as the title.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
I can sit.
Okay.
Floor is yours.
Excellent. So yes, thank you for having me tonight. And being able to be a guest here. And as Teo mentioned, this is a topic that came up in a super secret email list a while ago. And it's something where I just want to kind of take a quick tour through some of the techniques that we can use to enrich our visualizations in specifically the table and matrix visual using DAX. And I'm going to show some techniques, and it comes with a caveat. You know, it's not applicable in every situation. It's not like you're going to be throwing a bar chart or a line chart on the screen and really, using it all the time. But in the right circumstance, or being able to tweak something to use maybe a technique or a trick that you see tonight for your own purpose, hopefully it gives you some ideas for some of the possibilities that are out there without having to jump into a custom visual. So a little bit about myself. I'm David Eldersveld. I've got my Twitter and my blog linked there. And I'm based out of the Southwest Michigan area originally. And I moved over to the East Side Detroit area a few years ago, but Michigan based, and just really excited that, apart from the very strange and unfortunate circumstance, it actually allows me to be able to join your group tonight and be able to present this topic. So just very thankful that I'm able to join and be with you tonight. I'd encourage you to just unmute if you wanted to ask questions. I have chat up, but I'm not very good at monitoring the chat as I speak. So if there's something that really appeals to your eye, or you have a question about, just unmute, ask me. I'm completely casual tonight. So with that, kind of get started here. When I first started with Power BI back in 2015, I was really big into custom visuals. And custom visuals were pretty new at that point in time toward the end of the year. And, I was out there, I was developing stuff, and I had this kind of TypeScript, JavaScript type of background, but it was more of a hobby and I wasn't that good at it. And it just opened up a world of opportunity to me. And since then, I've kind of backed away a little bit from custom visuals as the features become more mature in Power BI. And I've kind of shifted my approach a bit. And I wanted to give you a little bit about how I might approach just the philosophy of selecting visuals, where, as Teo mentioned, this is a technique in particular that we had shared about 2 months ago, and he didn't know it was possible. And truthfully, until I test some of these things out, I don't know they're possible either. So it's one of those things where I'm in Power BI quite a bit, just kind of playing around, and maybe 1 out of 3 things works and it's worth of sharing, and then 2 are just kind of throwaway techniques and you just never really do anything with them. But I just encourage you to explore, right? And over time, I've grown to appreciate exploration within core visuals more and more, where just due to the level of support that we have in Power BI for built-in visuals, out-of-the-box visuals, if I put something that's built into my visualization pane into a report, I'm going to see that supported everywhere. And as you branch into things like custom visuals, and particularly if you have uncertified custom visuals, you lose a lot of that support. If someone says, I want to export this to PowerPoint, well, you lose all of that if you have an uncertified custom visual. And so in that regard, my view of custom visuals hasn't really soured, but I'm a little bit more intentional about using custom visuals. And the way that I would approach this is I would typically look at, are there techniques that we can use in DAX within reason? Performance wise, it has to work and what have you. But, can I get a visual like this, which it's called a horizon chart, in Power BI desktop without having to resort to a custom visual? And my approach would be, if I can do this in DAX to just reshape the data in some way using a measure or some other approach using DAX, I'm going to try to take that approach first before I go out to the marketplace and assume that I need to get that horizon chart custom visual that someone else has developed. And as I mentioned, that comes down a lot to support, but it's also something where, formatting and just design of the visual and how it fits with other visuals on the page, you never really know what you're going to get with custom visuals. Plus, they take forever to develop, and not everybody has that skill set. And it's just kind of a special situation where about 2 years ago or so, Microsoft Research released a tool called Charticulator. If you haven't looked into it, I'm not going to focus on it tonight, But if you're interested in exploring the ability to take some custom visualization to the next level without code or low code custom visual, look into Charticulator. Power BI.tips has another fork of this. I think it's just charts.powerbi.tips. And charticulator.com is the main site. But the basic idea is without knowing how to code TypeScript, you can go out and build a basic custom visual, which once again, you wouldn't be able to certify that custom visual, but in a pinch, it could work. As an absolute last resort now, I would go in and I'd say, let's look at building a custom visual. But although at one point in time, I had 3 visuals published to the marketplace, I only have 1 there now. And I would treat that as just absolute last resort, where, as I mentioned, the skill set doesn't really align with most of BI practitioners. People who are used to DAX and data modeling aren't necessarily the overlapping skill set of here's my TypeScript and here's my D3 for my data visualization library in JavaScript and so on and so forth. And I think Microsoft recognizes that there's not a lot of overlap. But if you work with partner visuals, companies like Zebra BI or Zoom Charts or OKViz, I tend to trust those custom visuals quite a bit. If I'm working with a hobbyist like myself, I still have that marketplace visual out there called Hexagon Scatterplot. I don't really support it, right? So you never know what you're going to get with custom visuals. With core visuals, you know that you always have that support. So kind of in that regard, before we get into some of the DAX, I just want to encourage you, if there's an opportunity to use conditional formatting as it's built right into Power BI's table or matrix or other visual, go ahead and use it. In particular, data bars is one that I use all the time, where if I'm working with an audience that really loves their tables, which if you've got people that have an Excel background and they're just used to looking at things like pivot tables, spice up that pivot table a bit, or spice up that table in Power BI using something like data bars or background color, conditional formatting. If this isn't something you're taking advantage of too often, it's built right into my values area now as well as format, and I can just come in and select, in this case, one of the 4 that I have on screen. And then there's also something called web URL, which is not too visual, but if you wanted to insert a hyperlink conditionally based on maybe a category and link out to say, if I had this manufacturer, this is just a dashboard and a data set for simplicity. But if I had something like this manufacturer and I wanted to link out to their website conditionally, that web URL would work for them. But I definitely encourage you, take advantage of what Power BI Desktop gives you when it comes to your report authoring before you jump into the more advanced type of scenarios or even really think about some of the advanced scenarios. But why are you really here tonight? It's to learn about how we can kind of bend some of the table or matrix formatting to build non-standard visualizations in kind of unique ways. And so if I wanted to go beyond basic conditional formatting here with Power BI, it's one of those things where I'm going to showcase a few different techniques, but I wanted to start with something that's built in as a quick measure, and that's called the star rating. And this will get into the more advanced bullet chart, which is the specific visual that Teo and I had discussed about 2 months ago. But it all kind of starts with this idea. And Chris Webb, who's now on the Power BI Cat team, he's got an awesome blog. And on another page, I reference a blog post of his, and I've got the site. But he has this star rating, or at least inspired the star rating, where if you have maybe a product, you purchase something on a site like Amazon and you rank that, you see these types of rankings all the time, 5 stars down to 0 stars. Is it good or is it bad? Power BI built that in as a quick measure. And you'll notice as I kind of walk through here, how I'm going to try to illustrate how I take this as a starting point and kind of layer things on top of it to eventually be able to get to a more advanced visualization. So before I get into the how-to of a lot of this stuff, I just want to show you, some of the visualizations that we'll be taking a look at tonight. So I do a little bit with star rating, and then although this bar chart would probably be better as a data bar conditional formatting, or at least easier, as a bar chart, it functions as an intermediate chart to get to this bullet chart that's next. So you can see here that I've built out in the DAX formatting here, just a series of bars. And the trick is, just like with the star visual, it's just a Unicode character. So there's a DAX function unicar that Chris uses in his star measure, and you could just paste in, anything. You go out to character map in Windows, or you go out to a website and look up an emoji. Not recommending emojis here, but the basic idea is if it's a character, you can put that into a value. And one of those is a bar, or when put together, it looks like a bar. And getting beyond a simple bar chart, we can look at something like a bullet chart. And I put in 2 different bullet charts here. There's on the bottom the custom visual bullet chart for reference, which will show you the value of the line. This is what the actual value is of the data in the bar. But then you'll notice a tiny little bar on each of these bars that shows you the target. And so the bullet chart is kind of a minimalist visual that's originally attributed to Stephen Few, who's very, very minimalist in his design. And it's one of those things where if you just wanted a simple way to gauge target versus value, you could look at things like your gauge visual, you could look at a KPI, so on and so forth. But the bullet chart is essentially just a bar chart that has a tiny little line that you can see the target and compare the actual to the target. So once again, it's just one of those minimalist visuals that a lot of people latch onto, a lot of people like and recommend. You can't quite do this right now in DAX, but you can approximate it. And the goal of tonight is to show you some of the ways that you can start to wrap your head around, maybe if you're in a pinch, like Teo was a few months ago, and you just wanted to do something in a table. I had the advantage here where I could just add columns to this table alongside this bullet chart. And although it's not going to give me the exact look and feel of the custom visual bullet chart, I can basically build upon the advantages of the table here where I can't do that in the custom visual. So once again, depending on your circumstance, you might find this valuable and you might want to learn to extend this, or you might prefer the custom visual. I'm not here to make judgments or tell you what to do. I'm just trying to open up some ideas for possibilities here.
Hi, David.
Hi.
Sorry for interrupting you. So a couple of things. The first thing that I want to emphasize that, and probably going to get to this later on when you start with the actual implementation, but the important thing here is that that graph actually repeats for the categories. That's the tricky part. That's the thing that I was talking about before, right? So the moment in Power BI you want to do like let's say a chart or a bullet graph that is nested and it repeats itself for every category, you're going to run into these limitations that actually David has overcome with this approach, right?
Yep.
So in reporting service, for example, you can do that, but you cannot do that in Power BI. And the second thing, David, that I want to ask you, we already have a question in the audience. Would you share this Power BI desktop file?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, so
that's great.
last page here, if you want to jump ahead and grab this even while I talk, if you want to explore this on your own, still pay attention to me, of course, but it's one of those things where I've got a short link here. You can go out to bit.ly and then this, I'll leave this up for a few seconds here as I speak, but go out here, it downloads a zip file. My website said my PBIX file was too dangerous. It wouldn't just let me upload a PBIX file, and I didn't want to put it on GitHub for whatever reason. So I've got it here as a zip. You just have to extract the zip and you'll get a PBIX, which is what I'm presenting from tonight.
Excellent. And you're going to share also the deck, the slide deck?
It's all built right into Power BI Desktop. So there's no deck. It's all as I go through, I'll just present right out of here. So.
Oh, okay. Well, great. Yeah, of course. That makes it simpler.
All right. So yeah, follow along if you want to get that PBIX file and follow along, feel free. And one of the things that I looked at as I approached this was other people that were in on that email. They immediately said, let's jump into SVG. And if you followed SVG with Power BI a few years ago, about 2 years ago, it became popular. and I'm going to get into it a little bit today. But you know, the basic idea is you don't have to use SVG all the time. This is a Unicode character-based way to do it, where it's not perfect, but it gets the job done in a pinch. Other things I'm going to look at tonight are pagination, where what happens if I wanted to. One of the things I really dislike about the table, I guess, is what I call this forever scroll. Like I can just kind of scroll down and you know, how do I find what I want? You know, Power BI just lets you scroll forever, right? And I'm going to show you a technique where if you wanted to just limit the number of items in a table and kind of paginate that table a little bit, say I want to go to page 7 or I want to go to page 33, you know, there's techniques that we can use in DAX to get that type of table set up as well. So it's not technically a visual, but once again, it's one of those DAX tricks that could be helpful if you have limited space or you want to avoid this kind of forever scrolling behavior in your tables. Technique here from Chris Webb on getting a static map image. So enriching your table with a measure that will plot, in this case, the cities, and even making that dynamic. So I'll show you how to employ this where if I wanted to increase or decrease the zoom factor for plotting out these maps, it's not just a static image anymore, where we're kind of making that a web call to Azure Maps. We'll take a look at that. And then I won't go too much into detail on SVG. I've got other presentations and a YouTube video that I did a webinar for Microsoft about 2 years ago on. And, you know, it's one of those things where SVG can be pretty advanced, or I guess just different, you know. And when the email went out two months ago, and a lot of people were jumping in saying you should do SVG. SVG will get you the look and the feel that you want, and this is what we're using now. If we wanted to have kind of workarounds for sparklines, for columns, and then other types of visuals right in the table, but you don't have to go there right away. You know, so I just wanted to you know, showcase that if you're comfortable using these Unicode characters for some of your techniques, you know, I think that's a lot more approachable because it's all done in DAX, whereas SVG, you have to kind of learn a little bit more about how SVG's shapes and objects work. All right, but let's get in to some of the how-to here. So back to the star rating. This is, as I mentioned, a quick measure where it kind of sets the tone for really everything that we want to do within the context of these table-based visualizations, or at least kind of sets the stage for some of them. But I'm going to go to New Quick Measure, and underneath the Select Calculation, there's a star rating option. So with star rating, it lets me select whatever the base value or base measure is. In this case, it'll be sales. And the disadvantage right now is I need to know a little bit about my data. And I'll take you through the evolution of this to make it more data driven, which will lead into the bar chart and lead into the bullet chart. But the basic idea is I have a star rating and it's going to be 0 to 5 stars, but I need to know, is the value of my data going to be 0 to 100, or could it be more dynamic? And the way that the quick measure is built is it has to be very static. Like I can't put in a measure here to define whatever my max is. And I want to be able to get there. So the star rating itself, I open up this measure, this is my basic quick measure star rating. And so by defining all those things in the user interface for the quick measure, it's going to define variables in my DAX, things like the number of stars and that rated value 0 to 100, and it has my base measure. And because my sales are in the millions and the max rated value is hard coded in at 100, I can see that all my stars are filled, right? That's not very useful to me. So what I can do is I can look at tweaking the DAX a bit to then move on to this adjusted sales star rating, the second measure here, where now I try to make this a little bit more dynamic. And the thing that I'm explicitly replacing here is instead of the max rated value of 100, sorry, this I didn't run this through DAX format or format it very well, but you know, if I wanted to read this, I basically have a max that's looking at the country, the context of the country, and saying what are the sales by country for everything that's relevant, that's all selected geography country. And what that gives me is that maximum value for the largest country. In this case, it's going to be the USA with 1.5 billion. And it basically would then say, I'm going to treat this as my max, and then everything in the dynamic range from 0 up to that 1.5 billion is going to be then proportionally allocated, in this case, to 5 stars. And the quick measure goes through and it normalizes the data, and I'm not going to go into the details of the calculation. I'm more about the results of it. But the really unique thing about Chris's core calculation here that made it into this quick measure is the DAX REPT function. So that will repeat whatever character, in this case, it's Unicar 9733. Visually it doesn't mean a whole lot to me, but that's a star. And it's going to repeat those stars for the actual values that it's going to need. And then it appends an empty star, that's the 9734, for whatever leftover characters. And so visually what this looks like is this setup here for adjusted sales star rating, where for the USA, because this is the maximum value, it has 5 stars filled in. And for Australia, because it's about half of the USA value, it has 2 stars filled in. It doesn't attempt to do half stars or anything like that. It's just if it fills up and rounds up, it's going to fill up that full star. But you'll notice that for things like Canada all the way down to Nigeria, there's no values. And that's because these values for sales are so small that it doesn't really work out that well to try to plot them on a 5-star rating. So to actually get the data to show up here for this star rating, you do something that it kind of takes away from the value of the visual as a star rating, but it kind of gets into the methodology that gets used later on for the bar chart, where if I extend the number of stars, in this case from 5 to 100, which is going to cause it to go way off screen, but now I've got 100 stars to work with. I've got a lot more visual stars or visual characters to use for that exact same calculation. Now I can see that when I get the 100 stars, these other smaller sales countries start to show up, whereas before, that wasn't really possible. And mentally, all you have to do, hopefully, is just substitute, instead of stars, now I just want to fill in a bar character. And that's how I get a bar chart. It's really no different flipping over to this bar chart here to say, instead of stars, let's now present these as blocks. And instead of empty stars, which I got on the star rating, now I have empty blocks. And there's a Unicode character for that as well. And doing this approach, I can look at this bar chart measure that I built, and you'll see I just borrowed from the star rating quick measure. So instead of using 100, which extended my column width so that it lost a lot of its value, I used 20. In this case, it's not really stars, it's bars, but hopefully you get the idea. But the same calculation can be employed. So calculate my max sales for, in this case, it's going to show up as the maximum for United States. Sorry, I switched over to manufacturer for this one. So it's going to show me the maximum sales for the manufacturers, and then the base value for whatever is in context at the time is going to show up as my sales. And it goes through that same normalization and finds the proportion for what's actually in the data versus what is that difference between the maximum value and my actual value, and that'll be the blanks. And instead of using the Unicode characters with that Unicar function in DAX, I simply went out to Windows Character Map, Symbol Map, and you could do the same thing. Search among all these characters here, but basically pick one and copy it, and you could just paste that right in here. And so in this case, instead of a star and an empty star, I just have a bar and a blank space. But other than that, same basic idea. And I built a bar chart right in my table without having any real coding other than using that quick measure. I just tweaked the existing quick measure to get the look that I wanted. Any questions so far coming through? I'm going to step. Yeah.
David, is color a feature of the character, or is it controllable through formatting?
That's a great question, because what this employs, you'll notice purple and green for my color. This is conditional formatting. So I'm taking this and extending it where, as I mentioned, I would probably use data bars for this particular bar chart. But, if I wanted to employ conditional formatting, I have a bar chart color that I've defined. And there are different ways to define conditional formatting, but I simply say arbitrarily, if the sales amount is greater than 500 million, it's going to be green. And if it's not, it's going to be purple. And sorry, I originally had different colors here. That's why it says green and orange. But the basic idea is I'm just applying a color code, a hex color code like you would with any kind of color value for Power BI. And it's a conditional formatting to say, if I want to apply this now for my bar chart, conditional formatting, and instead of background color or data bars, it's applied as a font color. Because remember, these are characters. They're just text characters. And so I'm going to adjust the font color to say, what's the field value? I have default for things like color scale, and I could define different rules. But in this case, because I wanted that fine grain calculation, relying on that DAX measure, I use the field value. And I simply need to select the bar chart color formatting measure, in this case from my sales table. So all I did was pick the measure that I had defined, hit OK, and now I've got that color built in. And you could just, you could define this however you wanted, whatever traits of the data or however you want to visually represent this. It's just that conditional formatting using that field value. Great question. Other questions?
I don't think we have any, David, at least not in the chat window, so let's keep on going.
Okay. So let's take that a step further and let's look at this bullet chart. So I use the bars here, and just like I had with the bar chart, I simply need to figure out what the range is. And the range is going to be defined slightly differently in this case. This is one that I had adapted from the star measure, but the basic ideas are the same. Where in this case, it's defined in a slightly different way. I've got the bar and the space and the target all defined toward the top. And the really unique thing about, and really the disadvantage of using a method like this is, depending on your font, different characters might be different widths. So unless I'm using a font that's monospaced like Courier New, or any other monospace font, I kind of have to tweak this. So it's never going to be exactly, like the bullet chart that I get in the custom visual, but approximately I can get it to be the width that I want when I have, in this case, the actual values of the bullet, the target values, and then kind of the space in between. And the really tricky part is, if your actual is not up to the target yet, how do I fill in that space in between if the width is different? And so you'll see in the sample this space multiplier. And I didn't really know what to call this other than, I'm just going to multiply my my width by this arbitrary value to adjust for the fact that my font will treat that, in this case, period for my space character a little bit differently than the bar. But when it comes to calculating the maximum, I'm simply employing the max value of the target across all the different categories. And that establishes a uniform axis for all those bars. And then I do the same thing for the maximum value for the data. Simple, max with a filter for all the selected categories. And the reason I have to do that for target versus value is because, unlike the normal bar chart, what happens in the bullet chart is I want my axis to be defined on the largest value or the largest target, whichever is greater. And so in this case, because category D has a value of 100, which is the largest among all the different possible values, I need to kind of compare max target and max value and say, well, what's greater, and use the greater one to establish the uniform axis here. And beyond that, it's just some math similar to the star rating, where the really unique thing about the bullet chart is to say, conditionally, if the difference between actual and target is greater than 0, what I want to do is build that bar chart and then use that space character with that space multiplier. But if the difference is less than the target, or if the value exceeds the target rather, I just need a bar chart and I need to figure out where the target could be inserted. And so it's basically substituting in the target character, that's the substitute DAX feature, to say wherever the target character should be based on the value, kind of find that within the string, and then make that substitution of the target character instead of the bar character. And the target character is just defined up here as this little pipe. And once again, it's one of those things where it's not like a bullet chart, right? Like you'd kind of have, if I were to build it in SVG, I don't get this kind of look down here exactly, but in terms of just an approximation with all the other advantages that I have in the table, it gets me close enough. It makes me comfortable where I, as a viewer, can say, yes, this is my actual value, and this is my target value, and I can see that range and whatever the difference is visually. So once again, it's just one of those things where, if this inspires ideas for you, definitely feel free to use it, adapt it. It's some of those things where it's not something you're going to be using every day, but in the right circumstance, hopefully it can be something you can extend on your own. And this uses conditional formatting as well, just like the bar chart did, where I have a color measure defined on blue and orange, and I'm simply looking at the font color and saying, if I have a field value that's defined as sample bullet color formatting, just use that. And just like I had with the bar chart, in this case, I've got a conditional statement where if the value is greater than the target, make it blue, otherwise orange. Just like with any kind of conditional formatting, you could define this however you want and make the colors adjust appropriately in your own parts. All right, so that's the bullet chart. And from a data visualization perspective, as I mentioned, there's some advantages in using this when it comes to just the convenience of it versus going out and building a custom visual or trying to use the SVG method in Power BI. But it's not going to give you 100% visual accuracy like you'd get if you were to go and use some of those more advanced methods, which isn't really always approachable for everybody. Let's look at pagination. So this technique is something where I'm going to completely rely on DAX measures to build out this dynamic paginated table. And it uses some what if parameters. I basically come in and under my modeling tab, I could define a new what if parameter. And all that really does is it'll add a disconnected table to your model that relies on this generate series. And if you've used what if parameters, you would know how this works already, but I'm just defining some range, but in this case between 1 and 20, and I'm incrementing that by 1. And what that ends up visually with the slicer is that range from 1 to 20. And I've got the slicer right here on the screen, and I'm going to be able to use this value later on in a subsequent calculation. Same thing for page number, where if I'm working with a paginated table, like on a website, you'll see these buttons and it'll be left or right, or maybe a drop down and I can select the page number. In Power BI, I don't get that, right? It's not a custom visual. I'm using the tools that I have at my disposal to kind of approximate some of the functionality that I might get in some other format. But I'm doing the best I can, right, with the tools that are there, the slicer, the DAX, and I'm not building a custom visual. The end result here is I don't have to go and build a custom visual. I want to avoid that as much as possible. So in this case, to build this out, what I'm doing is under my pagination sample table, it relies on this population rank. And this is going to be similar to a question that somebody asked in chat earlier, or at least the solution might be similar, where I'm using this rankx function. And I'm saying across all my locations, rank it by total population. In this case, I'm going to sort it descending. And the descending will mean that my #1 rank will be my highest population. If I sorted this ASC or ascending, it would mean that my lowest population would rank #1. But in this case, if I were to flip back to page 1, I want New York City. Oops. If I flip back to page 1, wrong slicer, and then maybe make this 8 or 10 in my table, I'm going to see the top 10 cities in the United States. And New York, based on that descending ranking in the rankx function, is going to show up as 1 instead of 1,000. And from this perspective, what's happening here is I have a series of additional supporting measures, such as page number check and page check. And all that's being done is it's going to look at the filter and say, if the page number, which is this measure here, if this page number is my current value, flip it as, or consider it 1 or true. For whatever reason, it would not allow me to use true and false. So I ended up using 1 and 0. But it's going to say, if this is true, use 1. And the way that the secret that really drives this is there's a filter applied for this paginated page number check. And it basically says, if it's 1, display it. So it's all filtered down to where it's 1. So the selected value, in this case for paginated page number, if I move this to 5, now page 5 is #1 or true for my filter, and you'll see the table adjust accordingly. And there are some other things that you can browse through the PYX file and try to work out how to reverse engineer this a little bit more completely. But the basic idea is it's another one of those things where, given some DAX and some time and some drive to be able to take an approach that's a little bit non-traditional, you can build things into Power BI that you just don't get out of the box. And as I mentioned, this is kind of my personal pet peeve here with a table where it can just scroll on forever. And in certain circumstances, I want to be able to avoid that. And that's where this paginated technique can really come into play. Another technique here is from Chris Webb, where what happens if you want to, in this case, display an image in a table. We've had images in tables forever, since Power BI has been around in 2015 or so. We've been able to come in and add image URLs, but we could only define an image URL on a column. And only in the summer of 2018 were we then able to set the data categories image URL for measure. And what that did is it unlocked the ability, actually let me find my map here so we can actually look at that data category. So I select my map measure, which defines all this, and you'll notice that the data category up at the top is set to image URL. This is really the trick that drives not only this map, but also the SVG images that you might have encountered across the Power BI community in the last 2 years. It's setting this data category so that if Power BI sees a URL, it's going to interpret it as not just text, but it's actually going to go out and try to get that URL, get the contents of that URL. And so what this map measure does is goes out and constructs the URL. And if you want to use Azure Maps, you could go out to portal.azure.com and sign up for the service and get your own key. And in my sample model here, I have just a throwaway key that I set as a parameter. So if you wanted to replicate this on your own, you'd simply need to change this Azure Maps key parameter to your own Azure Maps key that you could get out of the Azure portal. And then it would kind of use your own Azure Maps service. But with this, there's a free tier that gives you about 250,000 renders of maps. And so I'm not going and plotting a lot of data. I'm only plotting the top 10 cities here for sample, but hopefully it gives you an idea where if I wanted to use Azure Maps and I wanted to get up to that 250,000 renders per month for free, this could be a very viable solution if you just wanted to quickly get, in this case, a map on your table. And Chris went out and he constructs this sample URL and later concatenates it all down here at the bottom. And the only thing that I really added here was a what if parameter for the zoom value. But you can go out to Chris's blog post, which I've got down at the bottom here. If you download that PBIX later on, or if you've already done that, go out to this blog post. And the only thing I really enhanced here was this what if parameter for a map zoom. And just like we saw with the what if parameter for the different paginated examples, there's basically just a generate series saying from 0 to 20, look at the existing value, what's the selected value, and then factor that into a secondary measure. In this case, it's my map measure. So it takes what was just a static map image, and because this uses a measure, not a column, I can update this in real time. It's dynamically saying what's my what if parameter value for my map zoom instead of the original hard-coded 10 that Chris had, and just enhances it a little bit and allows you to say, if the user themselves wants to go in and look at that zoom, or if you wanted to extend this and then use satellite view instead of road view or what have you, you could basically make it as dynamic as you wanted in terms of the Azure Map URL call. But once again, it's one of those things where, just to kind of whet the appetite for some of the things that you could do in the table, it definitely takes it beyond your basic conditional formatting. It takes it beyond the basic text or numbers that you might used to be seeing in the table visual.
David, we've got a couple of questions. Apologize for interrupting your presentation. This goes back to the paginated table approach that you previously showed us. And the question here is, what if someone changes the sort order in the paginated table? I guess the question is if they, like, for example, in your case, you're sorting by population. What about if they, let's say, sort by location or something like that? Will the paginated approach still work?
So it's going to not work the way you'd expect. So if I have this forever scroll table and I sort on something location, it's going to sort alphabetically and it's going to factor in all, in this case, 1,000 values. I do lose that because, unlike this table here, where it's basically A to Y, it's only going to sort based on the context of what's displayed here in this. So yes, you do lose that. I've got Tracy down to Bloomington, and now I've got Bloomington down to Tracy. It's not going to look at Abilene down to Yuma. So yeah, that's a great point and illustrates that although the visual, is kind of unique and might look cool and works in the right circumstance, depending on how you might interact with it, it might not be the right solution for you.
Gotcha. And the second one is that from Nathaniel. This is really cool. Thanks, David. Could one include arrow images at the bottom of the paginated table for first page, previous page, next page, and last page, and then set those with conditional DAX to take someone to those particular pages? Seems like that would be the next logical step to that paging functionality.
So I personally have not tried to explore that yet, but that is really what inspired this original idea. Is I can go out to a website or even paginated reports, right? In Power BI, you have that ability to do my first and last and next and previous type of button navigation. And if I wanted to do this, with static buttons, you might approach this with something like bookmarks, and you can add a button and have a bookmark navigation. But that has its own set of limitations, right? Because now I'm defining 100 bookmarks, which I don't want to do. One of the techniques that might work there, if you use the technique that just came out for like dynamic page navigation, maybe that would work here. I haven't really had a chance to think it through or explore it, but that's one of the things that after this, I'll probably try to play around with a little bit and see where maybe I can have some buttons, not on the table, but under the table or what have you, to be able to approach a more robust navigation like that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Other questions?
I think that's all for now. I'm sure there's going to be more.
Okay. So I think from that perspective, it kind of shows you some of the things that you can do in the table. I'm not going to go into detail in SVG. It's one of those topics that's been out there for 2 years. And as I mentioned, it's one of those things where, it might be a little bit more to bite off than many people really want, because you are learning a new technology. SVG is really XML that defines a visualization. And you do get the more robust look of the visual, and in this case with the sparkline column and the sparkline line, which I'll just demonstrate here in a second. It looks like a line chart, it looks like a bar chart. Whereas with the bullet chart here, I don't get exactly the look that I would necessarily want all the time, but with SVG you could. But the trade-off with SVG is it's just really complicated if you've never been exposed to SVG in terms of how to build it. But 2 years ago, this is something that I had originally, I was conversing with another Microsoft MVP at the time, Megan Longoria, who used to work with me at BlueGranite. And one of the cool things about a conversation with Megan is she'll just say something, right? And I wonder if I could do this, and whatever. And we just have these little conversations about data visualization. And at one point, she looked at something that was this heat map back from a post in 2008 from excelcube.com. Can I get a visualization like this in Power BI? And we kind of kicked it around for a day or two, and using the Unicode technique and the 5-star type of setup, can we put circles on the screen? And the answer is yes. We could use this technique to build out a matrix that would have some circles based on the Unicode characters, but there's not enough Unicode characters to really do the dynamic sizing. And based on some earlier research on my blog that I'd published, I had like a part 2 and a part 1 and part 2 for using SVG. But this part 3 post is really where I get into the detail of how we actually can dynamically construct this SVG. And as I mentioned, if you've never seen SVG, you might be running for the hills right now, scared, like, what is this stuff? But essentially, you're defining an image URL where you're telling Power BI, look at this XML as an image, not as text. The text is scary, but the image is what you're after. And the really unique part about this was right around the same time that Megan and I were kind of discussing this setup. We only had columns available to us for the data category of image URL. And within a month, Power BI allowed us to do it on a measure basis. And that just unlocked a ton of opportunity around SVGs where you could go out to the quick measure gallery on the community site and just look at a dozen or so samples where people have extended this idea. But I'm not constrained to building these visualizations in columns and trying to approximate what happens if somebody needs to filter this, right? I can't build for every possible scenario as a column. It's just not within the realm of possibility to work for every possible scenario. But with a measure, you have that capability to dynamically be able to build out, in this case, a line chart, or in this case, a line chart with conditional formatting where I go from green to gray. And this line chart over on the right is just for validation to say within my spark line, the general shape just matches the line chart as it's plotted out there. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the SVG. That's not really a DAX trick. It kind of adds a little bit more in terms of knowing SVG than I think we're able to get into. But if this is an area that interests you, you can see if I hover over that in the tooltip, I'm basically just plotting out points. It's just a series of X and Y coordinates, and it's saying move from this coordinate, draw a line to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, so on and so forth. And it just builds out this text string, which is then simply applied as an image URL for my data category. So as text, Power BI might build this and say, I'm going to build that line and assemble all these points, but it just treats it as text until I come in here and assign the data categories image URL. For the map and for sparklines and other things you might want to do with SVG, that's really the key driver, is having image URL as a data category on a measure. If you're really interested in this topic, I did this webinar for Microsoft about 2 years ago. Go out and you could, see a few examples. I talk about this for an hour, but as I mentioned, it's one of those use cases that, it's cool, it's fun to do, but it's definitely not applicable in every circumstance, and it adds a very, it adds a layer of complexity that a lot of people aren't prepared for in Power BI. It's one of those workarounds that if you can use it, use it. Otherwise, don't really consider it. Rather lobby Power BI's product team to build sparklines in, and yeah, go from there.
So basically, SVG is, just for those of, I guess, those of you who are not familiar, is a visualization framework. Just like what was the other one, the popular D3.js, right?
Yep.
So basically what you're defining here, David, is essentially you're expressing this in a SVG format. And I believe one of the limitations of this is that the view box has to be a square.
Yes.
Has to be one-to-one. Is that a SVG limitation, or this is a Power BI limitation?
This is a Power BI limitation. And now that you bring that up, that actually, I think, factored into our email chain 2 months ago, where
Right.
I can't do this type of bullet chart setup because I'm limited to a 150 by 150 pixel square for SVG. If I go out to this quick measure gallery and look at the examples,
Mhm.
I'm at 150 by 150. I can't make that image bigger. So there's a kind of a severe limitation where if I wanted to do more advanced visualizations, if I think of maybe paginated reports and I do sub reports, right? There's no way I can do like advanced sub visuals in Power BI because I can't get them big enough in a table, at least. There used to
Right.
be.
Actually, for me, the biggest limitation is that we cannot do like a rectangular shapes like that bullet graph if you wanted to make it real nice, or some kind of a bar chart or something like that. Unfortunately, it's going to look very funny because if it's very long, then it has the same height
Yep.
as the width. Do you know why is this limitation in Power BI?
I don't know exactly why, and I don't want to speak for the product team, but it's always been that way. And with SVG, we are doing something that the product team never anticipated.
Right.
And it's one of those things where it was one of those, wow, that's crazy that we can actually do this. But just because we can do it doesn't mean that they're going to adjust the product to make it better as a workaround, right?
I'm just
So
curious because
yeah,
custom visuals obviously are not bound to this limitation. Custom visual actually can be rectangular. You can kind of size it. So I just don't know why it's limiting this to be a square shape.
yeah, it's a limitation of the table and the matrix. And as you
Mm,
mentioned, there used to be a custom visual called HTML Viewer that got pulled
yes.
off, and then there was the cloud scope image, which in a very famous blog post in June, they said we're done with that custom visual. And then Daniel Marchpatrick just released something in beta. I saw it on Twitter, but I haven't had a chance to use it yet. But it was kind of the HTML viewer for measures, and that could potentially be a viable replacement. But it's one of those things where, once again, as soon as you introduce a custom visual instead of the default visual, if your organization disables custom visuals or if they block uncertified visuals, you're kind of at that loss. You can't use it at all.
Well, obviously, the advantage of this technique is that you don't have any external dependencies. This is rendered all within Power BI. There are no calls to an external service, which definitely gives you quite a bit of advantage here. It's just that limitation that we have for the square makes it not very useful.
Yeah, it's one of those things, as I mentioned early on. I'm at the point in my Power BI career where I'm trying to use core visuals as much as possible.
Right.
So if I can get into the table or matrix, even if it's not as ideal, just due to all the other advantages of having it as a built-in visual,
Right.
I'll opt for that.
Right. And it's also faster. I would assume you don't have the overhead of visuals and it just renders, probably is going to render much faster. Excellent. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. So yeah, if there's any other questions over time, you get a chance to play around with the PBX file or what have you, I'm on Twitter. You can comment on my blog, one of the posts. Feel free to reach out. But yeah, thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Dave. So we have a couple of questions that just pop up. And if you guys, we are, I guess, about to wrap up sooner tonight. If you've got any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or post them in the chat window. So there is a question, can this SVG be done more simply with Python or R visualizations?
Yes. So the look of what you're trying to do with SVG, you could easily do with different chart libraries in Python or R, which also come with their own set of limitations, right? And one of those things that we see all the time on the R Python side is what packages are supported in the Power BI service, where if I have a visualization library in R, for instance, or Python, I've been using Altair, right? And that's not available. But if I have a basic Python library like matplotlib or an R ggplot2, yeah, I'll get support for that. But anything that Microsoft decides not to support or install in the Power BI service, I can't use. I also have to use a personal mode gateway, which if I want to refresh, an R script for not a visual, but on our script, I've got some limitations in R and Python that some people, at least large scale enterprise deployments, may not want to approach there.
Right. And this actually question popped up a few times in our discussion list. Do you know if Microsoft maintains a list of Python or R packages that they support on the server?
They do, but it's not as up to date as it could be. So on the documentation, I don't have it up, but maybe we can search for it. But we could search for Power BI R visual packages, and it might bring it up.
I think the first
Yeah.
link was, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Sorry, I'm used to using Bing and having to scroll down to find what I want. It's not always the first one. Look at that. But yes, this is not as up to date as it probably could be. It looks like it was May, but it's one of those things where what's there is not always what's exactly installed. And just know as well, there's a limitation mentioning exactly what our version is, 3.4.4. If you're already in a more up-to-date version, this one's 2 years old, right? That could cause some trouble too if you move from desktop to service and what have you. And from a small implementation or maybe an individual or team-based approach to using R Python, in my personal experience, it works great. I know Ryan Wade, my colleague Ryan here is on the call. He loves R. He uses it all the time, but it's one of those things where it's great for some circumstances and not great for others.
Got you. Thank you. So we have another one here. I guess questions start popping up. Can visuals created by SVG be published on-prem? I guess that means to Power BI report server.
I have never tried it, but I would assume that it can, because in report server with the PBX support, you're going to have support for that data category of image URL, just like you would in Power BI service. So I can't 100% say it, but I would very heavily assume that you could.
Got you. There is Ryan Waite, I guess your colleague reminds us to share the links. Maybe if you could, David, if you take a chance and maybe just copy that link and post it in the chat window, that will be awesome. I guess this is off topic here, but for those who missed the early announcements, the Tech Data Science Analytics has an online event to register for ethics in adversarial AI. Okay, so there is a link to that. There is somebody's asking, can you find an entry job for someone just out of college? If somebody can, has anything, please feel free to connect to Joshua, who is asking that question, and let him know. Okay, and that's your link. Any other questions from the group? Anything that you want to ask David, me, or have any, I guess, no more questions? Well, thank you so much, guys. I mean, I'm going to put that video. Remember, there is a link in those of you who join us later. There is, I shared a link for the recordings. So HTTPS bit.ly Atlanta BI Rex, HTTPS bit.ly Atlanta BI Rex. This is where I'm going to post it once it renders. Other than that, some great comments here, David. Maybe you see them. Very cool stuff. Thank you for taking the time to put together the presentation. Indeed, I agree. This is very useful. Very great presentation. Can I share a job post? Yes, you can definitely share. This is something that I asked in the very beginning. Somebody is asking. So if you have any job opportunity, please feel free to share it. David, great presentation. Okay, thank you. Kudos from everyone, David. Well, I guess, David, that's it. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with
Thanks
us.
for having me. Appreciate it.
And really appreciate it. Thank you for the great work you're doing also. Awesome. Cool. Okay, then. So there is discussion. Here are some job Fulton County Schools is looking for. Those of you who are interested in job opportunities, please take a look at the chat window. Can we get the link for the recording again? So I'm gonna put it also in the chat window. I think that'll be the best place. This is the abbreviated link for the recordings. Ryan Waite, I was in New Atlanta SQL Saturday in October, November. I would like some guidance with our SQL. Well, Ryan, if you're still on the call, somebody needs your help. Well, I think that's it, guys. I don't want to hold anybody else on the call. I mean, you can continue probably using the Teams for continuing the discussion. I'm going to see you next month. Again, August 3rd is going to be our next meeting, and we're going to talk about data visualization optimization techniques, how to make your reports faster. Until then, take care of yourself and stay healthy. Bye. Theo, could I possibly get a copy of the Power BI model that you were using early in the presentation? Linda, let's continue this discussion offline. And if you drop me an email, you know how to reach me. I'll be happy to kind of learn more about why you need it and how can I help. This is actually something that is based on a real life project for Teams utilization. So I just need to know why you need it. Great. All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you.